History as it happens, February 2nd, 2023. The burden of German history.
German government confirms it will send its Leopard battle tanks to Ukraine to aid in the war against Russia.
Olaf Schultz will give the go-ahead to send 14 tanks, paving the way for Poland and other European countries.
Berlin needs to give approval before any other armies can export their Leopards to Ukraine.
Germany will send tanks to Ukraine. After weeks of hesitance and becoming further embroiled in the war, Chancellor Olaf Schultz relented to criticism that Germany was shirking its responsibility to help a European neighbor victimized by Russia. If Germany is still haunted by its Nazi past, some argue enough time has passed for it to embrace a more interventionist foreign policy, despite or because of the memory of war and genocide. That's next as we report history as it happens. Podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
So they've always been on the cautious side, and generally with some internal opposition have incrementally moved towards a foreign policy stance that will never commensurate with Germany's economic power. I mean, Germany has become, of course, one of the major economic countries in the world, never wanting to play the role militarily of a superpower or a role anywhere commensurate with the economic power that they wield in the world economy. So they've erred on the side of caution.
German reluctance to send tanks to Ukraine can be summed up in one word, said Stephen Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, in a New York Times article. That word, history.
Dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab, wenn ja.
General Eisenhower, accompanied by Generals Bradley and Patton, their faces grim, inspects the concentration camp at Ohrdruf, Germany, captured by American troops. Everywhere are the emaciated dead.
Hitler, the war, genocide, followed by catastrophic defeat in 1945, produced a culture of anti-militarism and pacifism in Germany. Yes, the country eventually rearmed and West Germany joined NATO, but never again would Germans fan the flames of conquest. Instead, in a process that unfolded over many decades, Germans reckoned with their culpability in the Holocaust. And it was this anti-war tradition, the argument goes, that led to Chancellor Olaf Schultz's hesitation to send Ukraine tanks. Well, the reality is somewhat more complicated. It is true that Germans aren't looking to create a Fourth Reich, and before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, German defense spending was low and its army ill-equipped. But its political culture had already undergone a transformation, one that started in the 1990s, writes Stephen Milder in a recent article in the Boston Review. He points to Germany's involvement in the NATO mission in Kosovo in 1999, its deployment to Afghanistan after 9/11, and more recently, more than $1 billion in military aid to Ukraine, from helmets to heavy weapons, including rocket launchers, self-propelled howitzers, anti-aircraft guns, armored personnel vehicles, and air defense systems. Milder writes, as a result, a country where the very idea of intervening in foreign conflicts had once provoked widespread protest is now at pains to prove its commitment to assisting the armed self-defense of threatened groups. And Germany's gradual shift from pacifism to interventionism was to some degree because of, not despite, its history of war and genocide, led by parties on the German left, namely the Greens. Milder writes, there's a clear continuity between support for sending heavy weapons to Ukraine and the debates of the 1990s, when preventing wars of aggression, especially genocide, began to supersede the avoidance of armed struggle at all costs among Germany's pacifists. In other words, if I might translate, because of Hitler, Germany must stop new Hitlers, or Putin's, or whoever is waging war of aggression. So German history did influence the tank debate, but not only in the way many people believed. Yes, Germans are wary of getting deeply involved in war, and sending weapons to Ukraine to kill Russians does have an unpleasant echo of the past. But Chancellor Schultz was also criticized by those who want Germany to take a leading role in Central Europe to save Ukraine from Russian domination. Chris Browning is a professor emeritus of history at the University of North Carolina. He is an expert on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. Chris Browning, welcome back.
Thank you.
Let's just set aside at the start here the issue of whether Germany is still a pacifist power or is a post-pacifist power, as one article put it. And let's talk about the power of historical memory, because that is the issue here. At least that's what's being discussed when it came to Germany's reluctance, and they finally gave in, to send tanks to Ukraine. It was this idea that the burden of German history, because of World War II, the Holocaust, still weighs so heavily on the German mind. Why is historical memory so powerful in this context?
You might say the baseline for German historical memory is World War II, Hitler regime, and the catastrophic defeat. So at a number of points, Germany's had to kind of wrestle with what does that past mean. First was, of course, would they rearm and join NATO in the 50s? Then there was the whole debate over Ostpolitik, in which Willy Brandt said, will we accept the ethnic cleansing of Germans out of Eastern Europe and the new boundaries that were drawn after World War II? And then in the 80s, of course, there was, will we have mid-range missiles to counter the Russians? The 90s, Yugoslavia, Bosnia, and then coming in with NATO and Kosovo. Then, of course, September 11 and joining NATO with some forces in Afghanistan, and now this. So there's been a whole series of events in which they've had to reassess how far will we go and what are the limits on Germany given its past and given the burden of that past. So they've always been on the cautious side and generally with some internal opposition have incrementally moved towards a foreign policy stance that will never commensurate with Germany's economic power. I mean, Germany has become, of course, one of the major economic countries in the world, never wanting to play the role militarily of a superpower or a role anywhere commensurate with the economic power that they wield in the world economy. So they've erred on the side of caution and restraint because of the past and had to negotiate, in a sense, whatever involvement they've had militarily with a sense that Germany is never going to have a military role in the world commensurate either with what it used to be in the first half of the 20th century or with what its economic role in the world is today.
And that belief was based on a couple of things, not only from a German perspective of not wanting to get involved in a war, a shooting war again after what had happened, but also a more general belief that war doesn't work, that fanning the flames of war will only just produce more violence and won't bring about an end to the conflict. I mean, that's one criticism of sending the tanks to Ukraine, is that they won't, in the end, make a difference against Putin's armies.
Yeah, well, certainly when the Allies won World War II, the various policies were sort of decartelization, undo the German economic machine, denazification, and demilitarization. Of those, decartelization, keeping Germany as a weak economic power was abandoned in 1947. We put in the Marshall Plan, helped rebuild Germany. And of course, the 1950s, the economic miracle soon put it back into its role as a leading economic power. Denazification, purging and punishing Nazis didn't work, but in terms of neutralizing anti-democratic opposition to the new government, did work. That is, Nazis laid low, and there was nothing like the savage attack on the Bonn government that you had continually against Weimar from an unreconstructed authoritarian anti-democratic right in the 1920s leading up to Hitler. So demilitarization, in a sense, was the one that worked the quickest and most easily. Almost every German realized, as what you say, the futility of war. It wasn't that they felt so much guilt for what had happened earlier, but they realized that they had been suckered into a losing proposition and that war didn't pay and they weren't going to go down that path again. So here you had a kind of consensus, you might say, between right and left, the more pacifist left, and even on the right, that we were not going to go down the path of militarism as a solution to problems. Demilitarization was perhaps the least contested policy after the war in terms of creating a new German political culture. So that has always been there. And then the question is, how far do you go in making exceptions? How far does Germany, despite its anti-militaristic political culture, going to have to play some role? It will be less than what our economic power would be commensurate with, but we nonetheless can't be totally passive, totally inactive on the international scene, and that's required these episodic steps towards slightly more military involvement.
What it might be, as some observers have pointed out, is what was once a symbol of Germany's strength, being able to reject war, is now the cause of the criticism that it's not willing to defend Europe as the most powerful and influential country smack dab in Central Europe.
Yeah, there's no small irony in the fact that now the pressure is on Germany to step up and do its share. Now, that was there in the 50s in terms of will Germany rejoin NATO, will Germany rearm at all? And the decision to create a Bundeswehr and to be a member of NATO, which is a collective security agreement. And of course, Germany had conscription for a period, had a fairly large army from the 50s to 60s. For Germans, it's a real dilemma. That is, on the one hand, they realize the danger of a Putin-Russia reaching the Polish-Ukraine border, but they also realize the danger of escalation if you miscalculate and put in enough weapons that it triggers Putin to go over the edge. They face the same balancing act, you might say, that all of us, all the countries helping Ukraine do, but they're closer to it. It's not an imagined dilemma. I mean, it is a real dilemma that they face.
Yeah, I thought that the critics were overlooking that dilemma, not just from a historical perspective, but, in the here and now, right? To your earlier point, Kosovo, that was the first time the German armed forces were in action outside of Germany since 1945. Then, as you mentioned, there was a small peacekeeping force or a small force that was sent to Afghanistan as part of the global war on terror after 2001. But in this case, support for Ukraine is the majority popular view in Germany across the political spectrum among the pacifists, the Green Party people, with a few notable exceptions. So I was wondering, what is it about the tanks? And I think it has to do with who's involved here. Russia is a different opponent than, say, the Serbs or, the Kosovo situation.
I think there's two key things. One is, what does the tank symbolize? And while Germans would be overwhelmingly supportive of, quote, defensive weapons, the tank, certainly in German history, the Panzers, the Blitzkrieg, is so clearly symbolic of the offense, not the defense. And so what you are equipping Ukraine to do now is to basically liberate the rest of the Donbass and Crimea, or at least to push the Russians back. It's not to stop the Russians from taking Kiev and Kharkov, it's to push them back from where they are now, to enable the Ukrainians to have a successful offensive that the hope is would bring Putin to the negotiating table. Of course, we can only speculate. We know so little about what's going on in the inner politics of the Kremlin and the Russian government. It seems clear now the Russians are not going to, lop off huge hunks of Ukrainian territory or depose the Ukrainian government. If the minimal war aims on the West was to save a Ukrainian state, save Ukrainian sovereignty, save the Zelensky regime, that's been accomplished. If the goal is to recover territory up till the recent borders, the jumping off point of the 2022 invasion, we're very close to that. If the goal is to reverse things to 214 and retake the Crimea and that sliver of the Donbass that the secessionist separatists took with Putin's help back in 2014, then that again is a very different thing. So at the moment, there's great unclarity as to what the war aims are and who is supporting which and what weapons are needed to achieve which of those war aims. My guess is that in Germany, they'd be very supportive of recovering the 2022 boundaries. There would be much less enthusiasm to continue waging a war to recover the 2014 boundaries.
And whenever you're involved in a war without clear aims, that's dangerous. Whether you're involved in it directly like the Ukrainians are, or if you're expected to continue to supply one of the belligerents in the war.
Yeah, and at the moment, we haven't gotten back to the 2022 boundaries. So the conflict between which of those set of war aims we're fighting for hasn't reached the breaking point, because we're still recovering territory. Ukrainians are still recovering territory that the Russians took after 2022. I think many of the people that are helping them are hoping for a kind of what happened in Korea. That is, they drove back North Korean invasion, and then they had 2 years of absolutely futile fighting until they finally just simply had a ceasefire. There was never a peace treaty. They had a ceasefire and said, we fought for 2 years. Neither side can move the boundary. This is futile. let's put this war behind us. South Korea's sovereignty is saved. North Korea has been deterred. They're not likely to try it again, given what had happened. Let's just put this on ice. And so you had an end of the Korean War. That's my guess is what is eventually going to happen in the Ukrainian war, that at the point of exhaustion, when what people will have to put into the war is not worth what they're getting out on both sides, you'll have a ceasefire. No one will recognize it's permanent. They'll say a ceasefire, and it will become de facto permanent because no one will want to resume the war knowing that it's futile.
So let's return to 1945 now and the origins of Germany's pacifist politics that are said to be playing a role in these decisions right now, or at least the reluctance for a time to send the tanks to Ukraine. That decision's been reversed, as we know. This is your area of expertise as a scholar of the Nazi regime. Germany has been lauded for its ability to face its history and reckon with the past, pay reparations to Jewish people for the Holocaust. But in 1945, ordinary Germans in the ruins of their country, what were ordinary Germans' attitudes about their responsibility for what had happened?
Overwhelmingly, that they were the victims. They were the victims of Allied bombing. They were the victims of Red Army pillage and rape. They were the victims of a vast ethnic cleansing of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe. And they were the victims of the Hitler dictatorship, both from the repression of the dictatorship and bearing the burden of collective guilt after the war for what Hitler had done. And Adenauer's had to sum this up, that small number hardcore of Nazis had committed terrible crimes committed by the Nazis in the name of the German people, but without their permission or knowledge. So it was a vastly exculpatory narrative that the Nazis had done this, the Germans had not, and the Germans had paid the price. But what that did, in the sense, the bargain that Adenauer struck, he would pretend most Germans had not supported the Nazi regime, and he would not go after Nazis if they pretended that they had all been reluctant or nominal Nazis, had always been secret Democrats, and they would now behave as if they had always been Democrats and support the new democratic regime. And that was about a 15-year period. The Adenauer regime was not one of coming to grips with the Nazi crimes, but with anchoring the Bundesrepublik. And he was successful, both politically and economically. I mean, democracy did take hold, and the economy recovered spectacularly. And it's really not until a cluster of events in the late 50s, early 60s. 1958, you had what was called the Tilsit trial in Ulm. Now, this was the first time after the Nuremberg trials, when the Bundesrepublik gets sovereignty, the Allies turned back to Germany, jurisdiction over all the Nazi crimes committed, to do something. Because actually a very small number of people were tried by the Allies in the late 40s. From 1949 to 58, the Germans did very little in that regard and were doing less and less every year. There was no proactive policy. So that unless somebody walking through Tengelmann's food store ran into an old concentration camp guard that had beat him and ran to the police and said, so-and-so is here, there was no mechanism to research, hunt down, and bring Nazis to justice. It happened only, in a sense, by accidental encounters. And then in 1958, one of these accidental encounters led to the arrest of the commander of the so-called Tilsit Commando, which had been on the border with Lithuania, was one of the very first units to carry out mass killings in June, July of 1941. And here was a case where you had a prosecutor, instead of doing the minimum, did the maximum. Researched the Holocaust in Lithuania, sent out detectives to hunt these people down, brought 10 SS men to court, and convicted all of them. And at the same time gave a history lesson on the Holocaust outside of Auschwitz and the death camps, all these mass shootings in Eastern Europe. And that led in turn in 1960 to the creation of the Central Agency for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes, finally creating a judicial agency to look into past Nazi crimes, what crimes were committed, who committed them, who of those are still alive, what evidence could be found against them, and where do they live, so we can bring this dossier to the local prosecutor, who doesn't have to find them. He just has to prosecute the case after someone else has done all the work. And then, of course, in 1961 comes the arrest of Eichmann and the Eichmann trial. That precedes by just 2 years the first real key trial of the Central Agency, and that is the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial.
I was going to bring up that trial.
So this cluster of events between 58 and 63 opens up what Adenauer tried to keep in the genie's bottle, and it escapes. And that, of course, also comes with a new generation, what we now call the 68ers, willing to finally look at Germany's past, wasn't afraid to ask questions about it. Earlier, people knew not to ask the questions because they knew what the answers would be, which would be very terrible. The next generation actually wanted to know the answers because they didn't know them. That set in motion this case whereby a now prosperous and established Germany really did begin to look at its past seriously, both the historical profession, the academics, the scholars, and part of the judiciary. The most Nazified profession in Germany were the lawyers.
Yeah, you mentioned denazification in the beginning. As a political ideology, it was pushed out of the mainstream. But out of necessity, many former Nazis had to take jobs in the judiciary. They were civil servants, judges, etc.
There's not a great purge of personnel after 45. But in a sense, in 1933-34, of course, all sorts of Germans flocked to join the Nazi Party, wannabe Nazis, and learned how to behave like Nazis, and in the course of that became real Nazis. And, 45 to 51, in a sense, a lot of old Nazis now wanted to be wannabe Democrats, pretended to be Democrats, and in the course of that, some of them actually did become Democrats. They had to live up to what they pretended to be.
Don't blame me, blame Hitler, right?
Yeah, it was just somebody else. It was the Nazis and the SS, not the rest of us Germans.
Yeah, I want to return to the 60s in a moment. If you don't mind, we'll go back to 1945 because I read this book, The German War by Nicholas Stargart, and I was astonished to learn about this sense of German victimhood. Stargart talks about this dissonant dualism of German guilt. Two different conversations about guilt in Germany right after the war. One concerning the lost war and who bore responsibility for the German catastrophe, a self-pitying conversation within the German national community, as Stargart wrote. And the other conversation concerned German war crimes and involved a sense of moral reckoning which Germans expected to be enforced upon them by the victorious Allies. He says that by 1949, when the Reich's 3 successor states were in place. In all of them, there was a sense of German victimhood that came to overshadow any sense of shared responsibility for the suffering of Germany's victims. There was a myth for a long time that in the Soviet Union that the atrocities were committed by the Nazis and not regular units in the Wehrmacht, right?
One of the most successful historical whitewashes that was embedded in German popular consciousness was that the crimes were committed by the SS and the Wehrmacht had fought a conventional war, a clean war. They were soldiers like any other. And it completely erased the reality of Germany's, what Hitler had called a war of annihilation in the Soviet Union, where Hitler had said very specifically before the onset of the invasion, this will not be a conventional war. This will not be a war like we fought in France. This will be a war of destruction. And what he really meant was this will be a race war, this will be an ideological war, this will be a war of ethnic cleansing and mass demographic revolution, and it's to change the demographic map of Europe. That was bought into by the German army, and it was fought that way. The real, in a sense, self-exculpatory myth that was successfully established was that the German army had not been part of the Nazi enterprise. And that really isn't punctured till the 1990s. Scholarly-wise, it was. There were scholars writing books in the 70s and 80s detailed and documented very thoroughly the German army involvement in Yugoslavia and in Poland and in the Soviet Union in particular. But it was the so-called Wehrmacht exhibition that was started by a group in Hamburg in 1995 and then toured Germany. That was based almost entirely on letters and photos of rank-and-file German soldiers and low-level documents that clearly just blew away the whole idea that the army had fought a clean war uninvolved with the atrocities.
And Adenauer himself also helped fuel this idea, or at least he made some public statements to this effect, that there were still German POWs trapped in the Soviet Union long after they had all come home, buttressing this sense of German victimhood.
Yeah, many of the POWs stay in the Soviet Union until 1955. The last major group are released. and allowed to come home. Adenauer, of course, has a kind of very celebratory ceremonies to welcome the returning soldiers. Many who were kept 10 years had, in fact, been tried and convicted for crimes. They were, in a sense, in the Soviet gulag for occupation crimes. But then the agreement that Adenauer reaches with the Soviet government to release the last of these prisoners brings them home. The POW issue is finally laid to rest in 1955. But it is, again, one of the ongoing, as you say, one of the ongoing causes of a sense of victimization. Everybody else's POWs are home, but ours are not.
So, Chris Browning, let's return now to the really critical years when Germans start to reconcile and reckon with their past, which the country is still lauded for today, right? I think you'll agree. Ian Kershaw, in his book, The Global Age, about Europe after the Second World War, in his chapters about the 1950s, 1960s, when most West Germans, he writes, wanted to enjoy the benefits of the economic miracle and not dwell upon the past, but they could not altogether shut it out. And he says in 1961, an unlikely book at first sight, an analysis several hundred pages long of German diplomatic records before the First World War, written by Fritz Fischer, provoked enormously bitter controversy, turned conventional historical interpretation on its head, Kershaw writes. Until then, he had been little known outside professional circles. But his book rocked the conservative establishment, for he claimed on the basis of his research into the plans, beliefs, and actions of the German elites in the prelude, again, to the First World War, they had aimed at nothing less than conquest to establish Germany as a world power. So, in other words, Fischer purported to show that Hitler was the product of continuities in German history, reaching all the way back into the 19th century. Kershaw goes on to cite other examples, too, in the 1960s, even in pop culture, forced Germans to confront this chapter of their past. What can you say about that?
From the end of World War I on, the standard German official view was that the Versailles Treaty and its war guilt clause were wartime propaganda. Germany was no more responsible for World War I than the other powers, that Germany had not been the stubborn power that had kept the war going for so long. And the Foreign Office even issued a doctored documents book in the early 20s, the so-called White Book, to support that. And that was embraced by certainly all of the conservative side of the German historical profession. And so after World War II, this helped to try to encapsulate the Third Reich as a 12-year aberration. The Nazis were an aberration in an otherwise normal German history. What Fritz Fischer did when he said all of that is false, Germany was much more responsible for World War I than any of the other major powers. They're much more responsible for keeping the war going because of their grandiose war aims. And these war aims had a shocking similarity to Hitler's plans in Eastern Europe to establish a vast and permanent German empire there. And that you have to look at Germany. One, you have to look at Hitler as anchored in a long continuum of German expansionism and militarism, and that this started with the reunification of Germany in 1871, and certainly in the post-Bismarck period, building up to World War I, and continued really through World War II. The conservative half of the German side of the profession bitterly attacked that. Much of the popular press did too. Fischer was castigated as the German word was a Nestbeschmutzer, a man who dirtied his own nest. The documents were so overwhelmingly persuasive that eventually Germans came to accept what most diplomatic historians after World War II, with access to German records, already concluded. And that is, it was German brinksmanship and a German conscious gamble that was the most important factor in launching World War I, and that, yes, German war aims grew during the war. The longer the war went on, the more that they had to make the war worth it. And you had this problem of you can't end a war because the higher the cost of the war, the bigger you have to win. So that World War I became a mechanism of self-escalation of war aims, basically blocked getting out of it. So yes, what Fischer did was put World War I and Germany in the first half of the century into a continuity framework, not the Nazis as a 12-year freakish aberration unconnected to the rest of German history.
It sounds like you believe that Fischer's analysis still holds up fairly well?
Yeah, he went a little over the top. He aimed high to hit the mark. It's a little too conspiratorial. There was a lot more accident, but the accidents and unintended consequences nonetheless were done because of people willing to take risks and having certain mindsets predisposed Germany to accept the outbreak of war better than to make whatever compromise or sacrifice. That's just a fatalism. That basically Austria was collapsing. Austria was their main ally. Everybody else in their fervent imagination was getting more powerful. Germany's ally was getting weaker. Therefore, if there is going to be a war, better to fight it now. So everything you do is based on the gamble that war is not the worst thing that could happen.
During World War II and in 1945, when the war ended, Germans were aware what had been going on with the Holocaust. Not to the degree of specificity that they would have later on, but Germans knew that Jews were being persecuted and murdered in the East. When did it become common knowledge in this key period we're talking about here, 1960s? When did that become common?
Well, I think that comes out of the German trials themselves. The Auschwitz trial is the biggest, but Germany is conducting dozens and dozens of trials in the 60s and early 70s. Many of them happened under the radar. That is, they didn't get much press coverage unless it was a local person and would get covered in the local press. But the national press did cover, of course, things like the Frankfurt trial of Auschwitz, the Treblinka trial in Dusseldorf, and some of the more notorious Einsatzgruppen trials of these massacres. This, I think, was the first history lesson, you might say, for Germans on the breadth of and ubiquity of atrocities in Poland and in Soviet territory.
It couldn't be buried anymore. And on the subject of assigning guilt or blame, yes, the perpetrators of the Holocaust were the Nazis, the SS, and others, at the top of the hierarchy, if you will. But there were thousands of others who contributed in smaller ways, who were complicit or complacent in the persecution of the Jews, but they don't belong in the same category as the perpetrators. You get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem was the Germans had negatively reacted to Nuremberg Law, which had been crimes against humanity as established. Participation was interpreted judicially very broadly. So that, for instance, in the American military tribunals at the low level of concentration camp guards, the Dachau trial, the Majdanek trial, and whatever, it was done by American conspiracy theory. So if you contributed in any way to the running of the camp, and the purpose of the camp was to deprive people of freedom and to murder them, you were guilty. So you didn't have to be a personal participant in the taking of a life. You had to be a participant in the operation of an institution whose purpose was taking human life.
Like a railroad?
Well, they didn't even get that far, okay. But at least even the low-level killers could be tried without proving that they actually pulled the trigger and killed some individual. Just the fact that they're on the roster, they're there as concentration camp guards, you could prove they had been part of the killing enterprise. When the Germans then rejected the Nuremberg precedent, and they said, we will not have ex post facto law, we will go back to the German criminal code of 1940, before the mass killings begin. And it basically defined first-degree murder very narrowly, that it had to be a taking of a human life based upon some conditions. It had to be motivated by a base motive, and they'd accept race hatred as a base motive, or done maliciously, or done deceptively. And the result is that in the German trials, and after 1960, first-degree murder is the only thing that is beyond the statute of limitations. Accessory to murder and first-degree murder are the only things that can be tried. So all the little cogs who contributed in other ways, basically they're already past the statute of limitations. Yeah. So the guy who draws up a train schedule basically is going to be, not going to be in the dock. But even when you brought in all of the people from death squads and from concentration camps, if they pleaded that they did not identify with the crime itself, they didn't do it of their own volition, but only because they were ordered from above and it was willed by somebody else, then by German law, unless you could prove that they were an excestator, a gratuitous killer, who obviously was acting beyond and above the requirement to kill and actually did it with relish and torture and maliciousness, he basically can't be convicted. So you got these trials which historically revealed what had happened. But in terms of who could be convicted in the dock, basically it's a small number of notorious excess killers, gratuitous killers, sadists, torturers, who could be individually proven to have wanted to kill and have wanted to inflict suffering, and everybody else could get off the hook. Well, beyond the statute of limitations.
That's the other extreme. The two poles here are blaming the entire country and assessing the same level of guilt for everybody in the nation, those who just stood by and watched and didn't help their Jewish neighbors escape, all the way up to the Nazi perpetrators, versus this other pole where only the very worst of the worst get found guilty or prosecuted. I guess my point is here, this is a very sensitive and difficult issue, right? Especially when you're talking about Germans today, weighed down by their history, right? And the Holocaust, who don't want to get involved in another war. I mean, it could weigh on the entire nation, right? I guess that's not really a question, Chris Browning, but I guess you get my point, right?
From the 60s on, growing German consciousness of their own history, beyond the trials of the 60s and 70s. And of course, there was the Holocaust docudrama that NBC put on that was widely watched in Germany. And then you began to get, I guess I would say, the institutionalization of the acceptance of their past in the political culture. So that you had finally the creation of museums like the Topography of Terror in Berlin, the Wannsee House Conference Museum in Berlin. Virtually all the major concentration camps in Germany started as memorial sites, because, of course, the first victims of the concentration camps were Germans, political prisoners.
Socialists and others, yeah.
But now they've become education centers as well. They have taken on a function, we might say, of public education, of public dissemination of Germany's past.
There's a collective sense of responsibility to own up to this.
Yeah, this has grown very considerably in Germany, has been, I think, a very major accomplishment.
So to the debate as to whether Germany is still a pacifist country or whether there was a sea change in the 1990s, I tend to think that there was a change and that it is wrong to say that German pacifism is the majority viewpoint and is really what was behind the reluctance to send the tanks to Ukraine. I shared with you an article written by Stephen Milder, an assistant professor of European politics and society at the University of Groningen. Apparently you're familiar with him. He makes this point.
Yes, he's a graduate. He was a graduate student at University of North Carolina when I was there. He did his PhD at UNC.
Yeah, I mean, he makes the point that there was a real peace movement in Germany in the 50s and the 60s, and then again in the 1980s when NATO wanted to put intermediate range missiles in Europe in NATO countries. He said that changed, though, in the 90s when it was the German left, the Greens and others, that we now have a responsibility to prevent genocides.
I think Steve is exactly right that the Greens and the pacifist side of the Social Democrats in the 1990s changed significantly. There's a real dilemma. That is, on the one hand, they say never again war, nie wieder Krieg, and then never again Auschwitz, which is not to stand by when great humanitarian disasters and genocide are being committed. And Germany, as the author of the world's most notorious genocide, can't be a passive observer when you have a new genocide threatening. And of course, that meant with Yugoslavia, Bosnia, the siege of Sarajevo, and then the threatened ethnic cleansing of Kosovo, puts the never again war and never again Auschwitz into conflict, because you can't say never again Auschwitz unless you're willing to intervene. That means risking and going beyond never again war. So this was a real conflict, and one that in the end they tipped the scales towards never again Auschwitz. And as a part of NATO, Germany participated in the attack upon Serbia to prevent the ethnic cleansing of 300,000 Kosovars into northern Macedonia, and to creating a pure Serbian territory, which is what Milosevic wanted to do. And as we know, ethnic cleansing is usually the prelude to genocide. When you find out you can't move that many people, you kill them instead. Is not an uncommon historical sequence. So preventing massive ethnic cleansing is a conscious anti-genocide measure. internationally. People after it happened, I remember critics of Clinton, well, there was no gas chambers. The Serbs didn't kill hundreds of thousands of Kosovars. And I said, that's a sign of success. We actually got there in time this time, thank God. And we should be credited with not waiting until it happened. And when it was predictable, we acted preemptively. One of the few times any nation or group of nations, NATO, actually acted in time to prevent the predictable terror from taking place. So Germany at that point, and with the support of the left, did engage in preventive genocide.
Because it's been said that these later German politicians, they were too young to remember the old thinking, where Germany had to stay out of all of this. You know, as to Clinton, it's often said that this was his doctrine. I don't know if I'd say it was a doctrine, but he did say in 1999, February 26, a speech he gave.
It's easy, for example, to say that we really have no interest in who lives in this or that valley in Bosnia, or who owns a strip of brushland in the Horn of Africa, or some piece of parched earth by the Jordan River. But the true measure of our interests lies not in how small or distant these places are, or in whether we have trouble pronouncing their names. The question we must ask is, what are the consequences to our security of letting conflicts fester and spread? We cannot, indeed we should not, do everything or be everywhere. But where our values and our interests are at stake and where we can make a difference, we must be prepared to do so.
I think Clinton was actually felt a sincere guilt and mortification over Rwanda, where we had reacted very belatedly and badly. You know, the American embassy there was not allowed to use the so-called G word when they reported, and that we just turned our back and we had the ostrich. We put our head in the sand, pretended we didn't know what was happening, though it was being widely reported. Clinton was a bright enough man and historically aware enough that he realized afterwards that that was a major blot on his presidency and that he wasn't going to have a second one.
So the reason I wanted to speak to you, not only because you're very good at navigating my maze-like and somewhat incoherent questions, Chris Browning, but the reason I wanted to talk to you as a scholar of German history is because it bugged me the way people were dismissing the German hesitancy here, or some of the German reservations about getting further involved in a war that has no end in sight. Timothy Garton Ash was one of the more scathing critics of Olaf Schultz. He says Germans risk misinterpreting the lessons of their history. The German position is profoundly confused, referring to the tank issue, with the old thinking dead and the new not yet born. Well, I think he's wrong about that. We've just discussed it, that Germans have been on board more or less with a more involved role in other countries' affairs, foreign policy, right, when it comes to interventionism. It's just this situation is different, and it's dangerous. The escalation with a nuclear-armed Russia.
I think, again, it takes us back to the issue of what war aim are we aiding Ukraine to achieve? And at the moment, we know that we basically still want to push Russians back and hope that that brings them to the negotiating table. But what the negotiating position will be that we and the Ukrainians will both find in common that the Russians will accept, that's the great dilemma that we face in the future. And will tanks as the symbolic offensive weapon help with that? Given that we haven't even gotten back to the boundaries of 2022, I think yes. I think that we do have to continue to equip Ukraine to retake territory, but I think we also must be prepared to urge a negotiation if that becomes possible. And the timing of that and the threading of the needle of that are going to be very difficult, but the Germans are not irresponsible for being hesitant about that.
Yeah. Well, you know, in fairness to the critics who looked at this situation saying, are the Germans, do they really think that if Russia were to win, that it wouldn't negatively affect Germany? I mean, do they really want Russian tanks rolling through downtown Kyiv? I guess from the German perspective, for the opponents of deeper involvement, it was, we have a different relationship with Russia. You know, we get a lot of energy from Russia, etc. I guess some of those arguments aren't holding up very well now.
They certainly knew they did not want, there was this uniformity, they did not want Russia overrunning Ukraine. The question is how much of a Ukrainian offensive that you're going to enable. You know, when we go back, and Andrea Merkel in retrospect has been very criticized for the dependency on Russian gas.
Hoping to bring Russia into the European concert through business arrangements, right?
But in a sense, she was projecting on Russia what Germany itself had experienced. I mean, what brought Germany from the central power in Europe feeling threatened from both sides into a Western alliance, mainly being incorporated into a Western economy and being much more prosperous as part of the West than it ever was as a go-it-alone power. Then as Hitler said, after Versailles, we can't live within these boundaries. Germany will wither and die if it doesn't expand. Well, West Germany was even smaller and prospered far greater than Germany ever had. And so Merkel, reading history, said if we can embed Putin and Russia in the Western economy, if we can give them a vested interest in being part of the Western economy, if their petro economy becomes a part of the West, they can't do without us as customers. And that was not illogical. If Putin had been rational and sensible, he would have operated on that basis. The problem was, of course, she misread Putin and the degree of his grievances and the degree to which he was not seeking what was good for Russia, but what was good for his own megalomania and his own notion being the rebirth of Ivan the Terrible and Stalin and combined.
But he's not Hitler, and I think Garton Ash actually made that comparison, that he's the new Hitler, but he's not Hitler.
Her policy was based upon Putin as a utilitarian, rational thinker, and that if Russia was embedded in the West, not only would it become economically tied, but that would further Russian democracy too. And of course, the problem was in Germany, you had a dual track, democratization and economic recovery. In Russia, you had economically tied to the West through gas and through petroleum, but not democratizing, in fact, becoming ever more autocratic as Putin got his grip. And that she didn't read. I mean, in a sense, the fault of Merkel was that she didn't read the direction internally Russia was going, which meant that her calculations of Putin operating in a economically, pragmatically driven utilitarian way would not be operative. Authoritarian dictators become ever more isolated, ever more irrational, and that she couldn't bank on that anymore. It was a strategy getting into was not bad. It was that it wasn't monitored for, is it working and in which direction are things going? And they were not going in the right way.
And later this month, we'll have much more on Russia, Putin, and the war in Ukraine for the anniversary of the Russian invasion. We have a special series of episodes coming up. Chris Browning, we thank you for a fascinating conversation. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading to Beijing soon as U.S.-China relations remain in pretty bad shape. What's it going to take to turn things around? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.